Now that I have introduced what non-verbal information are and what verbal information are and why these are important for human-computer and also human interaction, I want to start presenting the most important kinds of non-verbal signals and non-verbal information for this week. I will start with gestures, which are most likely the most important non-verbal information that we can use in human-computer interaction. But typically, gestures are currently used with touchscreens, for example, or with cameras to operate a system by predefined commands. This means a user has to learn which gestures to use for operating a system or for a certain functionality. But of course, if I'm producing speech, engaging in a conversation, I naturally use gestures without a certain predefined function of that. That means there's a high variability in the gestures that we have. But still, we have actually 3 kinds of phases of a gesture. We are beginning with the preparation. This just means that the necessary parts of our body, in this case mostly hands and arms, are moved in the starting position. In order then, in the second phase, in the major phase, to produce the real stroke. And this is the archetypical or prototypical movement of the gesture that is iconic or relevant for the function, meaning, or at least the characteristic of the gesture. Then we have a third optional phase. This means we can retract our hands and arms again to a kind of resting position or somewhere else. But of course, this is optional because we can have a sequence of these gestures to form a gestural unit. In speech production, we assume that the gestures and the verbal information, the verbal gestures of our articulators are actually based on the same fundamental representation, which is rather abstract. This means when we produce a sentence that our gestures are not using any kind of additional cognitive resources, but it's natural to do that in accordance and even in high temporal synchrony with our utterances, what we are speaking. So there are certain loose relationships that we can define between the gestures and speech. For example, the gestural phase is usually or loosely correlated with the so-called intonation phrase, which is, in other terms, something like a spurt. So this means a kind of sentence or utterance that I can produce without having a certain break or without or silence or without the need for air and breathing. The stroke itself is often highly correlated and synchronized with the onset of a stressed syllable or the sentence stress. And then we have a loose correlation again between a gestural unit and a whole sentence, which might include several intonation phrases or several spurts. I also want to present a small classification of gestures, and I will go into details on the next slide. So we have emblems. Emblems are actually rather independent of speech, or at least they can be independent. And this means we have highly learned cultural dependent signals or signs. For example, for thumbs up for that was great, or for hitchhiking, or nodding for saying yes, or indicating yes. These are, however, learned. They can be used in isolation, but also with speech, and they are cultural dependent. So in another culture, in another country, they might have a totally different meaning. These are called emblems. Then we have affect display, something like facial expressions, but also my posture, and of course something like uncertainty. All these gestures are related to emotion and affect. Then we have so-called adapters. And these are defined by having nothing to do with the semantic meaning or the sentence that I'm actually uttering. For example, if I'm playing around with something that is making me discomfort. For example, with my hair. Of course, it may be similar to telling somebody intentionally that I'm thinking about it, but it could be just that I have an itch here. And if I have an itch here and there's nothing to do with my verbal production, then it is called an adapter. Another example would be playing around with the pen here. The most important or the most interesting class of gestures are the speech-related one, also called illustrators. So let's go into detail here. We have certain referent-related gestures. For example, spatial information. So if I'm pointing somewhere, this would be such kind of speech-related and speech companion gesture. That means I can easily use it within my or as modification or to support my utterances here. I can also signal relationship. Here's an example of kind of uncertainty in what I'm actually delivering to my interaction partner. And also there's of course punctuation, and these are nice because are highly temporally synchronized with my speech. For example, if I'm now telling you that I have 4 of these kind of gestures, I have first reference signals, second punctuation, third, and so on. These are temporally synchronized with my speech. And then there's interaction, all these kind of signals or these kind of gestures which are actually used for regulating who is going to talk and who is going to listen. Here's an example of such an interactive gesture. There's also another approach, a more semiotic approach by McNeil, and he's classifying gestures according to their semiotics, and that means, for example, we have again pointing gestures, deictic gestures. We have also iconic gestures. And I've already given you an example with a big fish that might be like this or like this. These iconic gestures are rather concrete. A little bit more abstract are metaphoric gestures. For example, referring to something that was said earlier or expressing that time goes by, these would be metaphoric gestures. And then again, we have beats which resemble the punctuations. So gestures are culturally dependent. This means actually a big obstacle for human-computer interaction. And here is a small figure summarizing an intercultural study on how to use gestures for a smart TV and media center. I don't want to go into detail. You can easily go on the website of these UX fellows and look at the study yourself. But the main result was that the more concrete the functions are that the users are using to map gestures to the functions, for example, to navigate to the next channel, to raise the volume of your media center, and so on. So these are all really predefined, pre-learned command gestures, and the only study goal was to find out which one would be the best fitting or most intuitive ones. Here we find that this is easy to find a common gesture for these really concrete, easy functions. But the more complex the functions get, for example, navigating in a certain menu or complex tasks like recording and so on, then people will diverge a lot, and especially between the different national cultures. So it is actually an issue to come up with a nice gestural interface for operating devices. After gestures, I want to talk about posture. So as with gestures, the whole body orientation, the posture, is also highly coordinated with the speech. For example, there's self-synchrony. So If you have a look at this nice picture, you can see that with production of sentences, especially the punctuation, that means the important syllables, the sentence stress, and so on, this is highly synchronized in a temporal way with certain movements of my head, of course, but also of my eyelids, eye closing, and other aspects. In this case, with the hands. So I present this here with a posture because it's nice to also talk about not only self-coordination, but coordination between people. So for example, if people in a group refer to each other and are directed to the same audience, they also tend to synchronize in certain way. This is not only for these kind of politicians depicted in this picture, but also if you talk to each other on a table, for example, you will observe, especially with the fast forward of your video, that people tend to use the same positions. For example, leaning on a table, leaning forward, leaning backward. This is not highly synchronized, but it is a pattern that you can observe. Now I have to go back a little bit to the last slide because I missed one point actually. So there's also interaction coordination. But I will talk about this a little bit later this week when I talk about turn-taking and back-channeling. Just to mention here, back-channeling, for example, are all these kind of so-called recipient signals that we produce when we're actively listening to a person talking. So for example, saying, uh-huh, or nodding with the head, or smiling, or something like this. All these signals which just show I'm listening, I'm still engaged in the conversation, you have my concentration, I'm focused on you. All these signals are of course highly synchronized with the speech and the nonverbal information of the real talker who has the floor. So now coming to gaze. Gaze, you might have heard about this already, is also important or well advanced in human-computer interaction. Gaze signals interest and concentration. Which areas are now in the focus, in the real focus of myself, in this case, in the focus of my eyes. So here you have a nice photograph of a so-called heat map, which just shows aggregated over time the time of the focus of the eyes, measured by eye tracking. We will talk about eye tracking in the second half of this lecture later on. Gaze also signals not only interest, but also other social aspects. For example, if I'm talking, usually I gaze less to my dialogue partner than when I'm listening. Also, social roles show differences in gazing. The gaze duration is typically a little bit increased for people with lower social roles. And therefore there are sometimes in some cultures, for example Western cultures, also gender differences. That means that females on average tend to gaze a little bit more when they are listening towards the dialogue partner who is speaking. Also likable people or very attractive people are usually watched and gazed more. But be careful, just looking in the general direction is not the same as actually focusing on a certain person in a sense of making eye contact. Eye contact is really typically quite short because it can easily be considered as a threat. Prestigious and highly self-confident people tend to have a little bit different pattern. When they're talking, in contrast to the rest of the population, they show even more increased gaze than when they are listening. So this difference between talking and listening is not as strong when highly popular or highly prestigious people are in focus. All that being said, it's just an average, so you can observe this, but typically there's a whole bunch of variance here. This means it's highly cultural dependent and situation dependent, and there are also a lot of individual differences here. So you cannot easily come up or identify certain role, status, or interest just by looking at the gaze patterns of a person. But there are general average tendencies that you can observe. And of course, it's interesting for human-computer interaction to react on gazing. For example, consider a system that should support people in planning a travel. So if there's a couple or family coming to this device or system and service and wants to get information for a nice flight or nice holidays, it's of course important to, or it could be beneficial to analyze the gaze patterns of these people in order to know when the system is targeted or addressed, or when the people are engaged in discussing with each other the content of the system and the situation. Let's come to voice. As I said in the beginning of this week's lecture, voice is used or expresses a lot of information, revealing information of the person speaking. So, for example, age, gender, regional background, certain physical properties of weight, for example, and also attractiveness. But also emotions are exhibited in voice, and even some aspects of personality. For example, highly extrovert people typically speak a little bit faster and have more pitch variation than others, than introvert people. On the downside, the problem is that we as human listeners tend to attribute a lot of aspects and characteristics towards people which we can see, or people that in this case we can hear, although these might not even be valid. So other personality traits, apart from extroversion, introversion, might not be actually visible or perceivable in the acoustic information. Nevertheless, humans tend to characterize people based on such information, regardless their validity. I also want to mention the pragmatic context. This means that in voice, aspects of irony or how to interpret the sentence meaning is affected and influenced by the way we are speaking. So by the pitch pattern, or by the way we are stressing a certain sentence or a certain syllable in the sentence. So the last topic for this video is space. Of course, with the emergence of social robots or other autonomous systems, it's highly important to know how people behave in space and how they orient each other and use space and manage to coordinate themselves in a given area. Here you see the typical so-called F formation. I don't know actually what F formation means, but I would say that it might mean the free field formation or the field formation. That means how people orient themselves in a given free space when you don't have like chairs or other obstacles that restrict people how they place themselves in the space. If you're interested, try to find it out, do some research what F formation is based on. What you can see here are actually three parts of the space. There's always, if you have a group, a small group, or even a couple of people, that means two people, engage in a conversation or acting as a group. They don't have to talk during this time. They just have to know or feel that they are behaving like a group. You have the so-called O space in the center. This is the interaction space, the space which is not occupied. And we need this to see what the other people are doing, to recognize the facial expressions, to recognize the posture, to see the gesturing, and also to really well hear what the people are talking. So this is the interaction space which is not occupied for transmitting social and verbal signals. Then we have P, the private space. This is where the people are actually arranged. The private space is quite small, and it covers not only the persons acting, but also their personal belongings, like maybe their jacket or their bag. And then we have the third kind of space, the outer space, which is not part of this kind of interaction. So if there's a group talking to each other in the so-called F formation, engaging or coming into this group is usually done in a certain manner. That means you cannot just interrupt there and go there into the private space and start interacting. You have to be invited. This means you usually try to, coming from the immediate environment, to catch some attention and then being invited to join the private space. People will look at you, make space in this private space area for you. Here you see the three phases of that. But of course, there are other formations. Not only there's the vis-a-vis position where people are actually in front of each other, but they can also have different angles. It really depends on the certain situation, what they are talking about and what is the surrounding environment, how they place each other. For example, in a given conversation, these formations may change a little bit. So while we are focused on each other because we are just greeting each other or saying goodbye, then we may have a lot of attention towards each other. That means face-to-face, vis-a-vis. And then after a while, this would be a little bit too intensive, so we may just have a certain angle to each other, like 90 degrees or something like this. And even people who know each other very well or watching something else might be like an old couple. They might stand side by side and watching the immediate environment while talking to each other. Anyway, all the time this is part of the F formation. So we have again this central empty space, this interaction space O, and people still tend to place themselves on this private space in one position or another. There are also, of course, other formations, like the no formation, where there is a group of people who are not engaged in interaction and therefore loosely placed somewhere else. We also have some more formal and learned formations, but this is not what naturally happens. So why is this important? Imagine, for example, a social robot or an autonomous system that is coming to a public space like an audience hall or an entrance hall of a bigger place. It would be awkward if this system which is moving would be too close or entering the private space of people. But if you want to have an interactive system, it would be also awkward to be too far away. So knowing these formations and how to actually interact into engaging in a conversation or an interaction is important for such mobile systems. And again, we have highly cultural dependencies. That means for certain cultures, this O space or P space might be different than for others. I now want to close the space aspect with two examples for more strict formations, not the F formation, it's not a free formation, but where the environment actually shapes the kind of conversation or interaction that is going on. At a bar, for example, think about these scheme or this figure as big bar or cocktail bar chairs where you really sink in. You wouldn't just stand up and move the chairs around, they are really heavy and fixed, but this formation, this chair layout actually influences who is talking to whom. Usually you really need some kind of easy eye contact. That means you are rather not talk to the person sitting right next to you, but the person you really don't have to orient to without any difficulties. So the arrows here are indicating the most likely conversations that are going to happen when people talk to each other. The second example is a classroom. And this is just indicating the kind of focus I would have as a teacher or lecturer while people are in a classroom or students in an audience hall. This is just the focus of the concentration and attention that a person speaking to a bunch of people in chairs would have. So again, the environment also shapes the way people interact with each other. As a summary, space is highly cultural dependent and context dependent. There's a real difference between private and more public situations and relationships. Again, an old couple standing side by side talking to each other would be perceived most likely as highly familiar and intimate, whereas people who don't know each other that well, like business partners, if they would do that, it would indicate no familiarity or intimacy, but rather maybe having a problem with each other. Again, status and social role also affects the space difference. So not only the cultural differences, but also the power, this social power affects how close we get to each other.